Please do not intend to try this. The content of this video is solely based on past human experiences and may vary according to a person's physical or mental state at a specific moment. All the information shared are merely for educational and entertainment purposes only.
So, the fact that we only have a limited number of hours each day, we actually spend 1/3 of it throughout our lifetime sleeping. In recent years, given all the temptations that are present in this current time, people have become more and more reluctant to go to bed. Especially among youngsters, who still find the world to be rather new and exciting. They would often stay up during the night, and sometimes even go on days without sleeping. Even the top people today, including famous entrepreneurs and CEOs, like Donald Trump, Jack Dorsey, Marissa Mayer, etc., have short sleep schedules. But that being said, there are some who actually suffers from certain medical conditions or insomnia, which leads to sleep deprivation, causing them to have problems falling asleep. So what does it feel like to not sleep? And what actually happens to our body when we don't sleep? Generally speaking, for a human body to constantly be in a healthy condition, it requires a minimum of 7 to 8 hours of sleep daily. An average person, depending on their condition, usually may only last at most 20 hours of being awake, before they start to notice any significant irregularities with their body. Any period above the 20-hour mark would render a person to be just as deficient as someone who is legally drunk behind the wheel. In 1965, an experiment was basically carried out by a 17-year-old high school student, Randy, who managed to survive through and stayed awake for the entire period of 11 days. According to what's been recorded, on day 2, Randy had already started to experience problems trying to focus with his eyes. It also quickly worsened, causing him to then have problems identifying objects by touch. On day 3, it has started to severely affect his mood in a bad way. His body started to feel uncoordinated, where he would experience offs and delays in his movements, causing him to have problems carrying out any motion or reaction in an accurate and precise manner. And as it went on, these effects snowballed and grew stronger. He was really struggling to concentrate, he even had short-term memory problems. And towards the end of the experiment, he became very paranoid, and even started to experience mild hallucinations. But Randy was considered to be very lucky, as after the experiment, he was able to recover without any long-term psychological or physical damages. This isn't always the case, as for some, it can very well lead to various severities, like hormonal imbalances, illnesses, and even death in extreme cases. Now what really happened to Randy's body in this period of time? Let us look into deeper, as to how our body reacts when we don't sleep. You see, while we're awake, our brain basically builds up lots of toxic wastes, including a toxic protein known as beta amyloid, which poses great risks to a person in developing dementia at later stages of their lives. These toxic wastes are usually cleared by the glymphatic system during every sleep cycle. In this process, our cerebrospinal fluid is used to flush away any toxic byproducts that has accumulated between cells. This basically refreshes the state of our brain and body, allowing us to carry out more tasks in the following day, showing how important sleeping is to a person. That being said, a deep sleep also somewhat acts as a great blood pressure medication to a person's body, reducing one's heart rate and rebooting the cardiovascular system. And when a person doesn't sleep, these all basically can't take place, hence, causing most of the above-mentioned problems to occur. In the initial stages of sleep deprivation, there are also a few changes that a person may notice or go through. One would basically start to crave for sugar and carbs, due to the release of a hormone called ghrelin, which makes a person hungry for fatty and sugary foods. And as one starts to eat more, they would also find it hard to stop, as their bodies now lack leptin, a chemical that your body relies on to know when it's full. One's testosterone level, on the other hand, will also drastically drop as a person gets more sleep deprived, causing them to lose their libido or sex drive. And fun fact, one who only sleeps for 4 to 5 hours a day will usually have a testosterone level of 10 years their senior. Next, would be a person's skin complexion. As cortisol level spikes due to the lack of sleep, it will start to break down the collagen in one's body, which is basically what keeps a person's skin firm. This will then start to cause dehydration in one's skin, causing them to look dry and pale, followed by an itching sensation. On top of that, sleep deprivation does also prevent one's brain from registering new memories. As seen earlier in Randy's experiment, one's memory inbox involuntarily shuts down, resulting in the person suffering short-term memory loss, causing them to have trouble processing any new information. This then also gradually progresses into the person ending up in a temporary amnesiac state. In the midst of this period, many would also succumb to a condition that's known as microsleep, where one would literally doze off constantly for several seconds without them even realizing it. This is often dangerous, as they would usually not be aware of their surroundings, causing accidents to happen. Now, not being able to sleep for prolonged periods of time also greatly decreases one's immune system. A person literally becomes more prone to diseases and illnesses having a low immune system. And apart from that, it also increases one's insulin resistance, which in turn increases their blood sugar levels, rendering a person at a much higher risk of developing diabetes. Another major negative symptom of sleep deprivation is the rise in blood pressure. The lack of sleep basically creates extra pressure on one's cardiovascular system, which over time leads to hypertrophic remodeling, resetting the entire cardiovascular system to work at a higher level, leading to hypertension. Now, as a person reaches into the later stages of sleep deprivation, it can be extremely dangerous and deadly. As all these symptoms gradually become severe, it basically prohibits a person to act and think straight. The lack of sleep now is capable of disturbing one's visual processing abilities, causing one to have false perceptions that can manifest as hallucination. This, along with a clogged brain and delayed response, basically puts a person now at a high risk of getting into an accident and hurting oneself. And if this still doesn't kill the person, the buildup of reactive oxygen species, also known as ROS, in one's gut would then act as the final straw, damaging the DNA, lipids, and proteins, and eventually triggering cell death, causing the person to finally die. But having all that said, there are a number of people who are known to have completely baffled medical experts, as their experiences had somehow defied all current scientific explanations. One of them is former Hungarian soldier, Paul Kern, who literally never slept again ever since his wild incident. Kern basically fought in World War I to avenge the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. During one of his battles, as he was carrying out his mission, a Russian bullet literally passed through Kern's temple and exited the back of his head. Fortunately for him, he was then found alive and rushed to the hospital. And after countless effort, the doctors managed to save his life, but with certain parts of his frontal lobes missing. And having woken up from his coma, during his recovery, Kern found everything to be perfectly normal, just that he now somehow couldn't fall asleep. He laid awake for many nights, not feeling tired at all. Doctors then started to monitor his condition and were baffled by his current state. Medical reports had come back showing that it's as if his body didn't have the need for sleep anymore. This continued on with many more observations being done, and even when Kern tries hard to get some shut-eye, his body just would not comply. It was then that the doctors had acknowledged that his condition is no longer a temporary effect. This has then led on to Kern beginning his new life without needing any sleep. Kern didn't really suffer from any severe long-term side effects, whereas the only downside he faced was that he now has a lot of newfound free time which needed to be filled. He would then start to read book after book every night when others are asleep. And as many in the medical field were still mind-boggled by his experience, Kern would also willingly allow himself to be examined and put under observation by various doctors and medical experts. But likewise, the results always seemed to have ended up in more questions than answers, as his cognitive functions were perfectly normal. No one has ever witnessed Kern falling asleep after the incident. And although he now has way more time in his life, his cost of living had most likely increased. He needed to take more meals in order to cover up for the calories in being awake, while also paying more for electricity as the lights in his house now are always on. Kern had then lived his whole life without sleeping till the day he died in 1943, at the age of 59, which sums up to him actually being fully awake for 40 straight years. So how does one explain all of that? And who's to say what's possible and what's not anymore? But nonetheless, not all of us are built like Paul Kern, and we don't have any supernatural abilities until proven. Therefore, sleep is still as important to most of us. But assuming if you do, and you no longer have to sleep anymore, what would you do with your newfound free time? Let us know in the comments. But until then, stay safe, my friends. And if you like the content, don't forget to leave a like or subscribe, as it'll greatly help us in growing our channel, allowing us to provide you with more constructive content in the future. See you next time.
be.